On the great plantations of the South, history often painted white women as fragile figures, bound by lace and custom, moving gently in the shadow of their powerful husbands. Yet behind the walls of the plantation houses and in the fields where labor never ceased, a darker truth breathed in silence. While the men claimed absolute authority over land and lives, the women also held power, and sometimes they used it in ways both hidden and cruel. Black men, already stripped of freedom and dignity by slavery, often found themselves at the mercy of their mistresses' gaze. In a society that spoke of white womanhood as pure and untouchable, these women could cross forbidden lines without consequence, because the enslaved men could never refuse them. To be an enslaved man under such eyes was to live in constant tension. The mistress might summon him under the pretense of work, only to impose her will in ways he dared not resist. To hesitate meant punishment. To refuse meant death. The system gave him no voice, no possibility of choice, no shield against her authority. What the world saw as a soft, delicate hand could in truth be the hand that pressed him into silence. This secret abuse was cloaked in the respectability of Southern gentility, never spoken of openly, yet carried out with the same certainty as the whip in the overseer's hand. For the white women themselves, some of this cruelty emerged from their own entrapment. In a society where husbands controlled wealth, land, and inheritance, many women found themselves powerless in their marriages. Their lives were bound by duty, their bodies by expectation. Some turned to enslaved men to reassert control in a world where they otherwise had none. But their pursuit of power came at the cost of inflicting unbearable suffering on those who could not defend themselves. For the enslaved, every stolen night or forced encounter was a reminder that even within slavery, where they were already denied humanity, new layers of torment could still be imposed. The violence was not always physical alone. There was humiliation that cut just as deeply. A black man forced into the mistress's chambers knew that his suffering could never be voiced. He lived with the knowledge that his body could be used against his will, and yet, if the relationship ever became known, he alone would be branded the transgressor. He bore the double weight of silence and blame. A false word, a rumor, even the hint of scandal could cost him his life. To endure was to survive, but survival itself often meant carrying invisible scars. The women, bound by social appearances, rarely admitted the truth of their actions, even to themselves. They were upheld by a society that never imagined them capable of such abuse, and so their secrets remained locked away, hidden behind smiles at Sunday service and whispers over tea. For the enslaved men, there was no such protection. They returned to the fields with lowered eyes, carrying memories they could not erase, knowing that their pain existed in a world that refused to acknowledge it. The imbalance of power was complete, and the silence surrounding it only deepened the suffering. It was a silence born of fear, of hypocrisy, of a world built on domination. In that silence, countless stories went unspoken, countless lives bent beneath the weight of abuses that history too often chose to forget. Yet within those shadows lies a truth that must be remembered, that slavery's cruelty was not only the lash and the chain, but also the hidden violations that shattered dignity and left wounds far beyond the reach of time. When the whispers of such hidden acts rose beyond the walls of the plantation, the weight of consequence fell not on the white women who initiated them, but on the enslaved men who were powerless to resist. If suspicions of closeness or intimacy between a mistress and a slave surfaced, the story was twisted until it became an accusation of seduction or assault by the man. In the eyes of the law and in the culture of the South, a white woman could never be guilty of corrupting herself. Instead, blame was thrust upon the enslaved man, who faced punishments so severe that they seemed designed not just to destroy the body, but to erase the very possibility of defiance. Some were whipped until they could no longer stand. Others were mutilated in ways meant to strip them of manhood forever. and many were hanged without trial, their deaths meant to serve as public warnings to others. Such punishments were acts of cruelty, but they were also acts of performance, staged for the eyes of the community. White men, eager to protect their household honor, often ignored the role of their wives and daughters, instead placing all shame upon the enslaved. This hypocrisy allowed the abuse to continue in silence, with one victim destroyed and the perpetrator quietly shielded. The enslaved man became both a scapegoat and a symbol, punished not for a crime, but for being the most vulnerable within a corrupt order. Even rumors could be enough to end a life. A passing glance, an overheard laugh, a servant seen walking in the wrong place at the wrong time. These were sparks that could ignite a deadly fire. The horror was not only in the violence, but in the impossibility of defense. An enslaved man had no right to testify, no chance to explain, no hope that anyone would hear his truth. The courts, the churches, the very fabric of society conspired against him. He was stripped of agency twice over, first by being forced into submission, and then by being punished as if he had been the aggressor. The contradiction was monstrous, yet it was sustained by a culture determined to preserve its own myths of purity and honor. Behind closed doors, some white women who had crossed these lines lived with fear of discovery, yet they knew the burden of consequence would never fall on them. They were protected by silence, protected by the fiction of innocence, and protected by the brutal willingness of men to destroy those who could not speak. The enslaved, meanwhile, carried terror in their bones. They worked in the fields by day, watched their families at night, and all the while lived with the knowledge that a whisper could bring a death sentence. Their very survival depended on invisibility, on silence, on bearing injustices too great to be measured. And yet, these stories did not vanish. They lived in the unspoken memory of the enslaved, in the songs and the fragments of testimony that would later surface, in the quiet endurance passed down through generations. Even as white society tried to bury the truth, it left marks that could not be hidden. The legacies of those abuses stretched far beyond the plantations, shaping the ways race, power, and gender continued to collide long after slavery ended. When freedom finally came, it did not erase the scars. For the descendants of the enslaved, the memory of being blamed for crimes they did not commit, of carrying shame that was never theirs, became part of the inherited pain of history. Families told stories in whispers, warning their sons to be careful, to never be seen in the wrong place, to never be caught alone with a white woman, because the dangers of accusation had not disappeared. The pattern of blame and violence carried forward into a new century, where false charges and brutal punishments continued to haunt black men. What began as silence on the plantation grew into silence in the wider world, a silence broken only when voices forced their way into history's record. At the same time, the myths of Southern purity persisted, painting white women as symbols of innocence, while ignoring the truths that had been hidden in shadow. This selective memory became part of the romanticized vision of the Old South, erasing not only the forced labor and the cruelty of the whip, but also the dark violations that had taken place in secret. To speak of it was to break a taboo, to challenge a story that many preferred to keep untold. And so, for generations, the narrative remained unbalanced, shaped by denial. Yet the truth, however painful, matters. It reminds us that slavery was not only the theft of freedom and labor, but also the theft of dignity, the breaking of bodies and spirits in ways that extended into the most intimate corners of life. It shows that abuse was not limited to the overseer's lash or the master's desires, but also came from those the world painted as powerless. In reality, even within their own restrictions, some white women turned the structures of slavery to their own ends, and their victims bore the cost in silence. To remember this is to resist forgetting the complexity of cruelty. It is to honor the men who could not speak for themselves, who carried burdens they did not choose, and who paid the highest prices for crimes that were never theirs. It is to strip away the false beauty of plantation myth and to see instead the human suffering hidden beneath its surface. The shadows of those abuses still linger, etched into memory and history alike, demanding that they not be ignored. For in telling these truths, the silence that once protected power begins to break, and with that break comes a step toward justice for voices long denied.